airstrike killed an elite Hezbollah commander in southern Lebanon Monday, the latest in an escalating exchange of strikes along the border that raises fears of another Mideast war, even as the fighting in Gaza exacts a mounting toll on civilians.
In the last week alone, Israel's killed a senior Hamas militant in an airstrike in Beirut. Hezbollah has fired barrages of rockets into Israel. The US has killed a militia commander in Baghdad. And Iran-backed rebels in Yemen have traded fire with the American Navy. Each strike and counterstrike increases the risk of the already catastrophic war in Gaza spilling across the region. And in the decades-old standoff pitting the US and Israel against Iran and allied militant groups, any part could choose an all-out war over a loss of face. As the intertwined chess game grows ever more complicated, the potential for miscalculation rises. I'm Charles de Ledesma.
This comes as U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken continues his visit to the Middle East for the fourth time since October.
U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, who met with Arab leaders on Sunday, said Washington opposes the forceful displacement of Palestinians from Gaza or the occupied West Bank.
Palestinian civilians must be able to return home as soon as conditions allow. They cannot, they must not be pressed to leave Gaza. We reject the statements by some Israeli ministers and lawmakers calling for a resettlement of Palestinians outside of Gaza.
Following talks with officials in Doha, Qatar, Blinken said the discussion also included efforts to free the more than 100 hostages still believed to be held by Hamas. Sunday marked the 3-month anniversary of the Israel-Hamas conflict. Rick Pantaleo, VOA News.
You'll find more at voanews.com. Again, that is voanews.com. This is VOA News. Despite recent waves of attacks, Ukraine's president says his country can defeat Russia with continued and expanding support.
In the closing days of 2023 and so far this year, Russia deployed nearly 300 missiles and more than 200 drones in attacks on Ukraine. And while Russia has relied on Iran for many of its drones, Ukrainian investigators and the White House say Russia recently began using North Korean-supplied ballistic missiles in attacks across Ukraine. Russia and North Korea deny the partnership. With Russia's invasion of Ukraine nearly entering a third year, Kyiv continues its push for material support while urging its Western partners to consider it a hub of allied weapon production. Arash Arabasadi, VOA News.
Congressional leaders have reached an agreement on top-line spending levels for the current fiscal year that could help avoid a partial government shutdown later in the month.
House Speaker Mike Johnson announced the deal reached with the Senate and the White House in a Dear Colleague letter to members on Sunday. The letter says the agreement will secure $16 billion in additional spending cuts from the previous agreement brokered by then-Speaker Kevin McCarthy and President Joe Biden, and is about $30 billion less than what the Senate was considering. Lawmakers needed an agreement on overall spending levels to provide funding for agencies, which was set to lapse January 19th for some agencies and February 2nd for others. Kim Lewis, VOA News.
Saturday, Taiwan will elect a new president and legislature. The vote will help determine Taiwan's ties with China, which threatens to take over the small island democracy.
Democracy in action as Taiwan enters the final stage of a general election. The big question is how to preserve these kind of events at all, amid threats from China, which sees Taiwan as its own. But few in Taiwan seem concerned about war, despite the Chinese threat. Lev Nachman is an assistant professor in politics with the National Chengchi University.
Just because there's a lot of fighter jets flying around Taiwan from the PRC doesn't mean that people in Taiwan go to Starbucks any less, because it's been going on for decades and decades, and that's not going to stop people from living their everyday life, even if they are keenly aware of what's around them.
Here in Taiwan, what really matters to many voters isn't necessarily the U.S. and China. The big concern is how to make Taiwan's democracy last as long as possible. Bill Gallo, VOA News, Taipei.
Thank you for watching. Can you do me a favor? Please leave a comment in the comments section below. That would really help. Thank you, and see you again soon.